Okay, so today we're talking about grain quality first. When you're marketing winter wheat, you're marketing into different market classes. So you'll buy the varieties based on the market class you intend to sell your grain into. Market classes are distinct by the brand color. So you have red and white varieties, and then the protein concentration of the grain. So there's soft, low protein, and hard, high protein market classes. Most of Ontario winter wheat is the soft market class, so low grain protein. There's some high protein wheat grown, but mostly low protein wheat or soft market wheat. And I'll just mention here that, if a farmer, say, is going to grow a hard variety, a high protein market class, they're still not guaranteed of getting a high protein concentration. They might not be able to sell into the hard market classes if they for whatever reason end up with grain, even though it's a hard variety, the grain is very low grain concentration if they don't have enough nitrogen fertilizer, something else is going on. So there are G by E by M effects on grain protein concentration, but we won't talk about that today. Here's what you can see differences in the brand color, hard versus white wheat classes. It looks different, the seeds, and then the end product. This is bread. It also looks different based on red or white brand and what the end user kind of wants it to look like. Okay, so I don't want to repeat myself here. Just keep going. Actually, let me skip back here. Soft wheat varieties, so low protein, are used in things like cookies, crackers, cakes, and large buyers would include Mondelez that make Ritz crackers. They make a bunch of cookies. Mondelez buys quite a bit of Ontario wheat, and they like it because Ontario winter wheat very consistent in quality, and these big manufacturers really care about consistency. When I speak to Mondelez folks, they really like Ontario grain quality and its consistency. Hard varieties would be your noodles and your breads. And the reason why you make noodles and breads out of high protein wheat is because of the better dough strength. The dough is stronger, so it allows bread to rise much higher, and that's quality that end users like. So here you can see photos of bread made with different types of wheat. So here, this is hard wheat, so high protein wheat that has a lot of gluten and high gluten to glutenin ratio. So you get lots of oven spring, and that looks really appealing, right, to buy. Compared to the other wheats, the smaller breads you see, this is lower protein wheat used, and it's just not as attractive. You don't get the oven spring that I guess consumers want. Consistency in grain quality in terms of protein concentration and other aspects I'm not talking about here is very, very important for the end users. If you're making cookies at home, you don't care if some are bigger or smaller than others. That doesn't matter, right? They're going to taste great. But if you're making 10,000 cookies a day and you're packaging them, you need to make sure that if you're adding 5 grams of wheat to make a cookie, the cookie is going to expand to end up with a diameter of 5 centimeters and a height of 0.5 centimeters. It has to be consistent. And that's why the end users care so much about consistent grain quality. In Ontario, there's an Ontario Cereal Crop Committee that's made up of farmers and users, breeders, a whole bunch of stakeholders. And this committee every year votes on which varieties are approved for use, because there can be certain varieties that are very high yielding, but if they don't have that consistent grain quality, the end users are not going to like that. The millers will not like that. They will not want those varieties to go to commercialization. So that's grain protein. Next is test weight, which is used for wheat and it's used for corn and many other crops. Test weight is an important grain quality parameter. So before I explain what test weight is, I got to explain how farmers are paid and how shipping works. So farmers are paid based on weight. They'll sell tons of grain or kilos of grain. They're not selling liters of grain or bushels of grain. They are selling by weight. But when you ship grain, when you're shipping grain by rail or by boat, you're generally limited by volume, right? You can only ship in a container so many liters of grain, or on a boat so many liters of grain. So if you're shipping grain and you're paying for shipping, the more weight you can fit into a given volume, into a given container, the more profitable it is, the cheaper it is to ship, right? Because you're paying per box. You're not paying by weight when you're shipping grain. Trucking is a little bit different. I'll talk about that in a moment. But we have this different perspectives. Farmers are getting paid by weight, and if you're shipping grain, you care about volume. Test weight brings these two things together. Test weight is a measure of, in a given volume, in a given liter, how much weight of grain can you fit. So higher test weight grain is higher quality. It means the kernels are denser. Literally, in kernels, there's air spaces, air pockets within the starch granules. And the bigger those air pockets are, the less dense that grain is, and so the lower test weight it is. So high quality wheat would be high test weight wheat, same with corn. And there's an advantage for millers. Milling efficiency is better with high test weights because you can get more output per hour. And high test weight also matters when you're shipping grain. If you have low test weight or lower than expected test weight grain, you can get docked when you're selling wheat. Again, you are selling by kilogram, you're selling by mass, by ton. But if your test weight is low, you can get docked. So for corn, the standard test weight is 56 pounds per bushel. You might get a bit of a increase in the price you receive if you have very high test weight corn, like 65 pounds a bushel, let's say. But if you have low test weight corn, for example, 53 pounds a bushel, you can get docked when you're selling your wheat if the set test weight is too low, okay? Now, farmers will generally use trucks. They'll truck their grain to an elevator or an end user, whoever's buying the grain. And when you're trucking grain, test weight doesn't really matter because trucks have a certain axle load limit. And when you're trucking grain, you're going to hit your axle load limit before you max out the volume of the truck. What if the truck can carry 10,000 liters of grain? You won't even get to 10,000 liters before you max out on the axle loads. But when you're shipping by rail, for example, test weight really matters because you're limited by volume, not weight. So this is someone I follow on Twitter, and they had a really good story I wanted to share. So this person bought 30 million bushels, or a friend bought 30 million bushels of corn. They had to pay for shipping, okay, from Western Minnesota. Now, they expected 56 pounds per bushel, your standard test weight corn. And they did the calculations for how many cars they'd need at $3,300 a car. But they got 53 pounds per bushel test weight corn, and instead of being able to fit 3,300 bushels on each car, they could only fit 3,100 bushels. So they were short 200 bushels per car. That means they had to pay for a lot more cars than they expected, right, when you're buying 30 million bushels. So you lose a lot more money if you're paying for shipping by rail and you're not getting 56-pound test weight corn. So that is test weight, the weight of grain you can fit in a given volume. So what's the takeaways? Understand the effect of planting date on winter wheat and how management can influence yield. Things like changing the seeding rate, things like starter fertilizer, and understand how grain quality, parameters of test weight and protein work. All right, let's now talk about crop rotation. And I would say that along with tillage, rotation and tillage are the foundations of a cropping system. So this is somewhat subjective, but we can divide crop rotations into either simple or complex ones. Simple ones would have 2 or fewer crops. So that would be things like a corn and soybean rotation, or monoculture like continuous corn, or diverse rotations, which is 3 or more crops in a 4-year period on the same field. So if you have 3 or more crops, we would call that diverse. Regardless of what those crops are, common ones would be like corn, soybeans, wheat. At least you're going, or corn, soybeans, wheat. As if you're growing 3 or more crops in a 4-year period on the same field. So that could include something like corn, soybeans, and then wheat. That's still 3 crops. Now let's first talk about field crop acreage in Ontario. The 3 big field crops are soybeans, followed by corn, followed by wheat. You can see the percentage of harvested acres. That translates roughly to 3 million acres of corn, 2 million acres of wheat, 2 million acres of corn, 1 million acres of wheat, and then everything else is basically a rounding error, your oats, your canola, your edible beans. In total, Ontario has 7 million acres of field crops. That's actually a lot. That's more than, say, Michigan. We also have 1.5 million acres of hay that I'm not including here. But hay is also a major crop in Ontario. When you look at the distribution over time, not surprising based on what we talked about earlier, that corn and soybean dominate, followed by winter wheat. Everything else is a rounding error. This has held true for the past 40 years. You're seeing data up to 2013, but it is the same in 2025. This pattern is basically the same across the northern Corn Belt. Here you see Minnesota, it's corn, soybeans. Here you see Iowa, it's basically only corn and soybeans. And Michigan, similar crop rotation mix to Ontario, corn, soybeans with some winter wheat. So, long story short, rotations have been simplifying, going primarily to corn and soybeans for a long time. Now, is this because farmers don't understand the benefits of diverse rotations? No. They do understand that when you're in simple rotations, there's problems that come with that. Weeds, diseases, problems with soil fertility, etc. Right? These are quotes from farmers from 100 years ago. Right? So this is not, people understand the basic agronomy. What about scientists? Scientists have been studying the benefits of diverse rotations, the challenges with simple rotations for a long time. So here are two studies from Agronomy Journal, good solid journal, from almost 100 years ago. And yeah, diverse rotations have benefits. Simple rotations have challenges, well known. Now, what are some major types of crop rotations across Ontario? There's continuous corn and continuous soybeans. This is becoming less and less popular over time, I should admit, but there are fields that are under continuous management. Continuous corn would be more popular or common, and it used to be much more common with livestock operations, people who had lots of manure and they needed to apply lots of manure. Because corn is responsive to manure, and you can apply high rates of manure to corn crops without issues like lodging or diseases. If you applied high rates of manure to wheat or soybeans, you can get lodging issues, you can get mold issues or disease issues. So continuous corn would be more popular with livestock. Then you have continuous soybeans, more popular as for cash cropping operations that don't have livestock. Corn-soybean rotation is probably the most common rotation across Ontario, just in terms of acres managed. The most popular three-crop rotation would be something like corn, soybeans, and winter wheat. It's excellent all-purpose. Dairy operations would have alfalfa, so you would have alfalfa for a couple of years. It's a perennial. You don't plant it every year, but you would terminate it once the stand becomes older and not as productive, and then you would maybe plant corn for grain or for silage. In southern Ontario, you also have a mix of other higher value field crops, things like protein processing tomatoes, sugar beets, and edible beans in rotation with things like corn or wheat. And in eastern and northern Ontario, you would have more spring wheat, oats, and canola in rotation with your main cash crops. We talked about the past reasons for crop rotation in a previous lecture, but there were a number of reasons why rotations tended to be more diverse earlier, about 100 years ago. So what are some present reasons for diverse crop rotations, right? Even though we now have herbicides and nitrogen fertilizers, more and more it is because of yield and profit improvements. Certainly in most recent times, rotations that have winter wheat tend to be more profitable, not just because the wheat itself is a higher value crop now and just in terms of pricing compared to corn, but also because having wheat in rotation improves yield stability. So yields in hot and dry weather, as I'll show you in a couple of slides, yields in hot and dry weather, so more stressful seasons, are higher when you have diverse rotations. It was very clear in 2025, cornfields that had alfalfa or more diverse rotations, they just looked better. They were just higher yielding. Okay, we'll talk about why in a moment. Other reasons would be things like improved fertilizer use efficiency, so you get better return on your nitrogen fertilizer investment. As herbicide-resistant weeds pop up, it helps to have diverse rotations where there are some herbicides you can use in certain crops to give you more options, and there are a number of benefits with even today with more diverse rotations. So some other reasons for diverse rotations would include if you're in no-till, if you're trying to reduce tillage, the data is very clear that the more diverse your rotation, if you have 3 or more crops in a 4-year period, no-till works much better. You don't get the yield penalties you would normally see with no-till crop production, or you wouldn't get as severe yield penalties in diverse rotations. You also have, like I said, better pest pressure management. You can manage pest pressure better and increased yields in hot and dry weather. So overall, you can get the data showing higher overall profitability in more diverse rotations. The Ontario data, there's 2 long-term experiments showing very clear. Now, let's define what the rotation effect is. So, like I mentioned earlier, rotations reduce pest pressure, they reduce disease pressure, and they also improve soil fertility. So the rotation effect is the yield benefit of diverse rotations once you take that out of the equation, once you control for those factors. So here you can see a bird's eye view in the lower right of a long-term crop rotation experiment at the Elora Research Station. So these plots are managed all the same. They get all the same herbicides, the same fertilizer rates, the same pesticides, whatever. The only difference is different crop rotations. And even controlling for pest pressure, and even having high rates of fertilizer applied to all the plots, so getting rid of the soil fertility effect, we still have higher yields in the diverse rotations. So that is the rotation effect. It's these greater yields even when we control for these other factors. And the question that agronomists will ask farmers is that if you have wheat in your rotation, and because of that you have higher corn yields and higher soybean yields, does that yield improvement, that profit improvement in corn and soybeans, do you attribute that to the wheat? Because if you don't, maybe you're going to look at wheat as not being competitive with your other crops. But in reality, you should be attributing that yield improvement in the wheat and the soybean that you're getting from that third crop, like wheat, you should attribute it to that third crop. So let's talk a little bit about the rotation effect here. And this is data from Ontario, but this is replicated many other places in North America. So here we see this is data on 6 different crop rotations. Here we have in a 4-year period, they're growing corn, soybeans, wheat, corn, oats, barley, corn, soybeans, wheat, and then a red clover cover crop, and corn, alfalfa, corn, oats, red clover, cover crop, barley, red clover. So you see diverse rotations, and then we have the rotation effect. So this is the percent yield as a percent increase over the continuous corn mean yield. So if you're just growing corn on corn, this is the yield benefit you get compared to just growing continuous corn. Now this is long-term data. So they have 30 or 40 years of data here, and they divided every growing season into either optimal growing season, so high yielding, warm and moist conditions, hot and dry, which is like what we had in 2025, and cool and wet. So the hot and dry, cool and wet would be lower yielding, more stressful seasons. And what we see is that this yield benefit, the improvement in corn yield, is greatest in hot and dry seasons compared to optimal seasons, these white bars. So the yield benefit in the hot and dry, the red bars, is much higher than what you get in optimal. I just want to bring you to that, bring that to your attention. So, based on this data from 2 long-term trials in Ontario, one at Elora, one at Ridgetown, they found that diverse rotations had 15% greater corn yields and 13% greater soybean yields on average, and that's over time. And that's the main benefit of that is the rotation in hot and dry seasons. And what they found was it didn't really matter what that third crop is, right? As long as you have 3 crops in a 4-year period, you are getting a rotation effect benefit. And the question is why? We're not 100% sure why. We think that that third crop can improve soil structure, can improve rooting depth, and therefore water availability in those hot and dry years. But we're still not 100% sure what's going on. Here is the influence of crop rotation on tillage. So there's a rotation by tillage interaction, again, going by these interactions in cropping systems. So here we have rotation in three different grain yield of corn in three different crop rotations: continuous corn, soybeans, so a simple rotation, and then corn, soybeans, and wheat. So this would be a diverse rotation. And then they have, this is data over 10 years, so average corn yields. When they're applying, I would say slightly lower than average fertilizer nitrogen rate. So 120 to 160 pounds is a bit lower than average. Farmers now would probably be applying in this area like closer to 200 pounds. So we have corn yields across our three rotations, either moldboard plowed, so this would be intensive tillage, or no-till, so no tillage at all. And what we can see here is that in continuous corn, going to no-till from tillage reduces yields by 20 bushels an acre, right? 173 to 153. But once you get a two-crop rotation, right, corn, soy, you get a slight yield increase with no-till. And when you go to corn, soybeans, wheat, you get higher yields, but you get a much higher yields in corn, soybeans, wheat, right? You're getting 186 bushels compared to 153 bushels, where if you're in a full tillage system, you're getting 173 versus 182. So if you're in no-till, the yield benefit of diverse rotations is much greater than the yield benefit in a tilled system. And so in Ontario, most agronomists would say that if you're doing no-till, you need to be in a complex rotation. Okay. So now let's talk about profitability, because it's not just yields, but it's also profitability. And this is recent research published based on Ontario data, where they just studied agronomics and the economics of more diverse rotations. And yes, yields improved with that third crop in rotation. The yields of corn and soybeans improved. We already know that, but the profitability improved as well compared to simpler rotations, just by having three crops in a 4-year time frame. Now, what they show is that these third crops are more profitable, but you have to attribute that yield benefit to the third crop in rotation. When you do that, that third crop, it's overall more profitable. Okay, so here are the takeaways for this section of the lecture. Now let's talk about crop management decisions in the spring. This will obviously be a high level. I won't cover everything, but I'll cover three important parts, starting with spring tillage. There's many different types of implements available to do tillage. Purposes of spring tillage include weed management, incorporating anything you've broadcasted like fertilizers or manure, warming and drying the soils for seeding, and then preparing the seed bed by getting a good mix of aggregate sizing. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Another reason to do spring tillage would be to level the soil. So farmers, for example, will roll. You're not disturbing the soil. You're compacting it when you roll the soil. It's literally just a big roller. And the reason you do that is to keep it more level, so that, for example, if you're going to harvest soybean, you can put the combine as low to the ground as possible to get all the pods on that plant without getting soil in your combine, right? Because that's just a pain in the butt. So lots of reasons to do spring tillage. Not often, if you do spring tillage in soils with high clay content, there's a couple of risks. First, you have to wait for the soil to dry to do tillage. You can't do tillage if the soil's too wet, and you might end up waiting, a long time if you're waiting for the soil to dry if it's a clay soil. So maybe you just won't do tillage, right? Farmers will on high clay content soils might opt to not do any tillage in the spring. The other thing is that when you do tillage on clay soils, much more prone to crusting, which I'll talk about in a minute. This is a bird's eye view of what different tillage implements do. You won't need to remember all of these names per se, but we can divide tillage implements as either responsible for primary tillage or secondary tillage. So primary tillage is lots of soil mixing, lots of soil inversion, a lot more soil disturbance. So that would be things like the moldboard plow, the chisel plow, and the heavy disc, which there's none here. The subsoiler I would call also primary tillage because you're tilling very deep and you're trying to break up loosened soil at depth. We also have secondary tillage where you're not tilling very deep, you're not doing full soil inversion. The issue, what you're trying to do is dry out the soil a little bit, break down residue, improve seedbed conditions, so get good aggregate sizing, and you're not doing heavy soil inversion. So that would be like field cultivator, vertical till, or shallow disc. Now, strip till is kind of a mix between primary and secondary tillage, or really a mix between primary and no-till. So in a strip till, you see here 4 strips. These are either shanks. I think these are shanks. What they're doing here is they're tilling a strip. And in between what you see here, in between, the soil is left untilled. So this soil is basically no-till, and this soil is basically tilled, right, with the strip. So on a strip-tilled field, half the soil is tilled, half the soil is no-tilled. And the farmer will plant right in the middle of the strip. They're planting their seeds in the tilled strip, and that's what they're doing. So one reason for spring tillage is to size up the seedbed or size up the soil aggregates to create a good seedbed. The ideal seedbed is comprised of about 50% micro aggregates, less than 2 millimeters in diameter, and half macro aggregates. And you can see here what a good seedbed looks like. It's a mix of aggregate sizes. Here you can see it separated out, what those aggregates look like. Now, one issue with spring tillage is you're improving the seedbed, but you're also you're increasing the likelihood of getting soil crusting. So when you do spring tillage, if you get a very heavy rainfall soon after doing spring tillage, or soon after planting, the soil, because it's so loosened, the rain can create this crust on the soil surface that makes it hard for plants to pop out of. So farmers have to balance, when is rain coming? When am I going to plant? What's the risk of soil crusting? It's higher on clay soils. So, there's decision making that has to happen. Next is herbicide applications. So there's lots of different herbicides. You can divide them into either pre-emergent or post-emergent herbicides. Pre-emergent herbicides are applied before the weeds emerge. So you're trying to kill these weeds as the seeds are germinating. It's generally applied to the soil. It requires rainfall to move into the soil profile and get activated. And it's easier to kill these weeds because they're very, very small. Basically, these herbicides enter when the seedling emerges through the radicle. The radicle will absorb that herbicide and kill the plant, the seed, before it emerges. Then there's post-emergent herbicides. This has to be applied to the actively growing weed. Normally you apply post-emergent herbicides when the crop is also growing. Okay, so if you're doing that, the main crop must be tolerant to the post-emergent herbicide. Okay, so the other thing is that this post-emergent herbicide, it has to contact the leaves because it's normally absorbed through the foliage, through the leaves. Now, every herbicide has a specific mode of action, and this describes the biochemical pathway through which the herbicide kills the weed. So here you can see a farmer spraying a post-emergent herbicide, and this post-emergent herbicide has a specific mode of action. All right. Now, resistant weeds are not going to be resistant to a specific type of herbicide. They're going to be resistant to a specific mode of action. So, ideally, best practice is to mix herbicides that have different modes of action. The reason you do that is because if the weed on a field is resistant to, say, group 13 herbicides, group 16 herbicides, that's the mode of action. Group 16 herbicides have the same mode of action. But if you're mixing herbicides that are, have the mode of action, group 7, whatever, you'll still kill those weeds because it's resistant to one mode of action, but not the other. So A best practice, and farmers are moving towards this more and more just because of the increased prevalence of herbicide-tolerant weeds, is to mix 2, 3 modes of action together. And the big seed companies, the soybeans and corn hybrids they're going to be releasing 5 years' time, are going to have resistance to 5 or 6 different modes of action because they know that that's what farmers will be using in a growing season. So these crops have to be resistant to multiple modes of action to allow for post-emergent applications. Now, when you're applying a herbicide, it's not as easy as just okay, putting this in the tank and spraying. There's some things you have to think through. One would be drift. So let's say you're spraying a post-emergent herbicide. The crop you're spraying it on is resistant to that herbicide because it has a GM trait of some kind, but your neighbor is growing oats or something else that's not resistant to the herbicide. Well, if that herbicide drifts right through the wind, and that depends on things like temperature and wind speed and the inversion, risk of inversion. If that herbicide you're spraying drifts onto your neighbor's field, that all those oats will die, and then you have a neighbor that won't be very happy. Okay, and there can be issues in terms of inadvertently killing neighboring fields' crops. Herbicides also have certain labels. So you can only apply herbicides at given growth stages of the crop. You can only apply at a certain time period from harvest because you don't want to contaminate any of the grain. You don't want any of that herbicide to be translocated or be on the grain when it's harvested. And there's also restrictions in terms of following crops. So if you apply certain herbicides, the label will say, okay, if you apply this herbicide the next year, you cannot grow wheat, for example. All herbicides have a restricted entry interval. So once you spray that herbicide, you cannot go back into that field just for health reasons for a certain amount of time. And you can normally tell it smells very different. If once a herbicide's applied, it'll smell for a day or two, depending on the wind. So considerations. The final principle I'll talk about is the critical weed-free period, which is very important in terms of timing herbicides applications. The critical weed-free period is just a time period where the presence of any crop will reduce yields dramatically. So keeping the field free of weeds is most important during the critical weed-free period of the crop life cycle. There's a critical weed-free period defined for basically every crop grown in Ontario, and it generally starts at emergence. So the critical weed-free period is always early in the crop life cycle. So it's always the early part of the season where it's most critical to keep the field weed-free. This is how data from Ontario about how they figured out the critical weed-free period for quinoa. So I just want to walk you through. So we have the weed-free period in days after crop emergence, and then the relative yield % of weed-free control. So the weed-free control is when they would go in and manually weed every single day the plots to keep the plots free of weeds throughout the crop life cycle. So 100% would be yield at the of the weed-free control. Then what they did is they said, okay, we're going to remove weeds up until 14 days after emergence, up until 7 days after emergence, and up until 0 days after emergence. So we just won't get rid of weeds. So for these two data points, what they did is they would weed every day until 7 days after emergence and then stop. So weeds could start emerging and growing. Or they waited 14 days. They got rid of weeds every day after emergence until day 14, and then they would let the weeds grow unimpeded. Here, this again is the control. They just never weeded the plots. And what you can see here is that they got 95% of the weed-free control, so weeding every single day throughout the crop life cycle, as long as they weeded for the first 14 days of the crop life cycle. So the critical weed-free period in quinoa is 14 days. Because as long as you keep the field free of weeds for 14 days after emergence, you'll get really high yields. Okay? So that is the critical weed-free period for quinoa, 14 days, and it's critical. That's why it's called the critical weed-free period. Go figure. Next thing is tile drainage. This is not spring management per se. It's something that farmers will install on their fields, but it plays a big role in the spring. So what is tile drainage? It's literally when a farmer installs drains through their field to improve basically drainage, so water movement off and away from that field. So tile drainage is often installed after crop harvest. It's not installed in the spring, but its benefit is mainly found in the spring. So here you can see tiles that run up and down the field, and the tiles run out to an outlet, and then it runs into a ditch, and the ditch drains off of the field. So drains are generally managed by the county, these drains, because many different farm fields will drain into them. But here, the farmer or the landowner is the one that is paying and installing the subsurface tile drains. Here you can see what tile drain looks like. This is more modern tile drain that's just plastic. It used to be clay tiles or clay, and here you can see it being installed. Okay, so it's basically installed, I would say close to a meter in depth. It really depends, and there has to be a slope, but it's installed deep, right? It's installed fairly deep, so tillage won't affect it. Okay, so this is what happens with and without tile drainage, right? If you don't have tile drainage, you tend to get ponding, right? This can kill things like winter wheat or winter canola, but it also slows down field operations in the spring because you have to wait for the topsoil to dry to be able to do field traffic. We have a very short growing season, and so what these tile drains do is they facilitate drainage. They lower the water table, and what that means is that you don't get this ponding. You get faster soil drying in the spring, meaning that you can commence field work earlier. This is an example of what can happen if you do field operations on soils that are not fit for it. You get lots of mucking, you get lots of ruts, you get lots of compaction. So tile drainage can help avoid this kind of outcome. Now, you might be thinking, you're moving water away off of the field, and that would probably mean that, well, hey, you're more likely of risk for drought. And is that true? And the answer is no. The answer is that generally, it's a little bit, but generally tile drainage does not exacerbate, drought or water stress in crops. And the reason is tile drainage is not sucking the water out of the field. Tile drainage only takes water that is above the field capacity of that soil. So anything above field capacity is what drains through those tiles. Now, remember that above field capacity, there's water that's being in the soil pores. But below field capacity, there's still quite a bit of water available. And so once you do tile drainage, you're not getting rid of all of the water. You're not even getting rid of most of the water. You're only getting rid of water that is above the field capacity. And roots in saturated soils, so soils above field capacity, they can't work effectively anyway, because in saturated soils, there's low oxygen availability, and roots need oxygen. They respire just like us. So the answer is that tile drainage is still a benefit. Even in dry seasons, it's not going to exacerbate drought. Last crop management decision I will go through is choosing a cultivar or hybrid. So if you just know you're going to grow corn, you know you're going to grow wheat or soybean, what's the variety or hybrid you should use? There's many different availables, different companies. How do farmers make that decision? They'll often try it out themselves, right? They'll either do small plot trials, try a new hybrid on a part of a field, or they'll look at their neighbors. There's also publicly available data from crop committees. There's ones for soybeans, wheat, barley, oats, canola, etc., where they grow 30 different hybrids or varieties in trials across the province, and you can look at that data to see what hybrids are working best in the region my farm is in. Farmers also have to decide on seed treatments. So a fungicide or an insecticide seed treatment, that's an additional cost where the seed is coated in a fungicide or insecticide. And not always an economic payback, but it's just a big risk reduction. Because if you apply a fungicide or insecticide, you're just guaranteed, I won't be getting any issues. Not guaranteed, but a high likelihood of not having any issues. So when you're choosing cultivars, there's lots of things to think about or a farmer needs to think about. We already mentioned the maturity rating, so the how long it takes to reach maturity. But there's also things like height, the lodging susceptibility, its susceptibility to different diseases. So if you know you have clubroot, for example, you're growing canola and you have clubroot in your field, you're going to want to select a canola variety that is highly resistant to clubroot and a whole other bunch of parameters. Okay. Here's some examples of other ways soybeans, for example, are distinguished. This is changing over time, but are you going to grow Extend soybeans or Enlist soybeans? They have very different management because they're tolerant to different herbicides. There's different management based on if you're growing Enlist versus Extend soybeans. You don't need to remember any of this. The point is that there's a lot of things that go into the decision making. Here you can see what treated seed looks like. On the right is untreated wheat. On the right is wheat seed that is treated with a fungicide. By law, the fungicide has to be colored. It has to be very obvious because if you're handling treated seed, you need to say wear gloves, wear a respirator because the fungicide is dusty. It can get on things and, just for health reasons. Now, during the growing season, farmers use adaptive management. And this is a very general term to say that farmers will have a plan, right? They have a plan at the start of the growing season. This is a herbicide I'm using. This is when I'll apply a fungicide or I won't apply a fungicide. But generally, farmers adapt to the growing season. They have a plan, but then they change their plans all the time to figure out, based on the growing season, based on what I'm dealing with, what should I do? Okay, so the key takeaway here is farmers adapt to what the growing season is giving them. And they adapt also based on things like, recommendations for agronomists, recommendations from extension agents. So extension agents might say, we're seeing tar spot in this area, a new disease, a new foliar disease. Now we're starting to recommend fungicide applications, right? So farmers have to consider, okay, there's new diseases in my area. Farmers will scout. Scouting is literally just looking through the crop and seeing, what's the plant stand? Are there any diseases present? Are there any nutrient deficiencies present? And so they're adapting their management. They don't have a plan at the start of the season that they stick to. Okay, so this is my last slide of the lecture. It's been a while. It was great being with you guys. And, I just want to point out that in the lectures, I've talked about, why is Ontario cropping system so productive, and we talk about G by E by M. But in a global context, I would say Canadian agriculture, we have good but not great climate, right? Compared to South America, where they can grow 3 crops a year, we don't have great climate. We have good but not great soil. You go to the Midwest, you go to Illinois, you go to Indiana, and they have organic soils like 3 feet deep. They can take super deep soil samples there because their soils are so rich. They're beautiful soils. We don't have that here. But our cropping systems are so successful because of the people. It's because of the people like you. It's the know-how, the knowledge, the experience, the expertise that makes Canadian agriculture so successful. So it's going to be up to you guys when you enter the industry to keep it that way. How to do well on the final exam, just take notes on what the takeaways are.